danger is stealing in as relapse hums above the din. It's hard to know if this will be the day when you give in. Give in.
Hello and welcome to episode 351 of the Thinking Poker Podcast from Owings Mills, Maryland. I'm Andrew Brokus. I will be joined shortly by Clayton Fletcher in New York, New York. Many of you will know Clayton as a professional poker player and a professional comedian who hosts the Tournament Poker Edge podcast and has been a frequent guest on the Thinking Poker Podcast. Today's appearance by Clayton is going to be a departure from our usual fare. It is not terribly poker related, except that it is a conversation between myself and my friend and fellow poker professional, Clayton. He is, as I said, also a professional comedian, and this episode is a conversation between him and me about political correctness, freedom of expression, and so-called cancel culture, really with an emphasis on the world of comedy, although those topics certainly have come up in the poker world as well. This began as a conversation on Twitter. It soon became clear that it was too big for Twitter, and so we decided to do it as a podcast episode instead. This is not, there's not going to be really a strategy in this. There's not poker strategy in this episode. There's not even terribly much poker discussion. Obviously, both of our views on things are perhaps informed by our experiences in the poker world, but this is not really a conversation about poker for those of you who are sticklers about such things. A few other things that I want to say up front. First, this is not intended as a definitive anything. Clayton and I were not, just spoiler alert, we're not coming to any conclusions or reaching any tidy resolutions. This is just two friends with somewhat different views on a controversial subject, trying to better understand each other's perspectives and the issue at large, and to have a conversation with an emphasis on understanding rather than arguing or trying to prove anything. So I hope that if you choose to listen, you'll listen with that same objective. I know probably just about everybody has their own opinions on this subject, and hopefully you'll gain some new perspective from hearing ours. Speaking of perspectives, we are both middle-aged, financially comfortable in sex, straight white men. In many ways, we disagree, but we're not trying to present this as a matter of you're hearing like both sides of the issue. There's a lot more than two sides to this issue, and we're really not offering anything more than just our own thoughtful, reasonably informed perspectives. And finally, we do talk bluntly about these issues. We are sometimes discussing examples of jokes that are arguably racist, sexist, or transphobic. We try to do that respectfully, but do be aware that you will hear those things during this conversation if you choose to listen to it. Okay, I think that's everything. With that in mind, please enjoy my conversation with Clayton Fletcher. Okay, well, Clayton, thank you for agreeing to do this with me, but also just for, being open to sharing your ideas in general on Twitter and wherever else. I know there's always some sort of, I feel like almost no matter what you say, someone is going to give you a hard time about it. So I think we're both fairly good about sticking our necks out a little bit on Twitter, but I appreciate that you're willing to do that and willing to do it here as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm quite a masochist on Twitter. A lot of the things that I tweet, I actually know that I'm going to get some sort of backlash. Oh, yeah. But you know what? It's just I don't really take any of the backlash, if you will, personally. It's just, the fact of life is people see things differently. And for me, I enjoy getting the other points of view as long as they're delivered in a respectful way, which is often too tall of an order for the Twitter community.
Right. No, that's the thing. And I guess, the last time you were on here, we talked about this a little bit, and I shared that article with you. I think I didn't actually link it in the show notes, so I'll try to do that this time. But, I think the really critical thing is, like, I do think it's important to be, exposed to ideas from, that you disagree with, or from people you disagree with, or whatever. And I think the important thing is that those need to be credible sources. Like, it's helpful that we're friends who both respect each other, because now it's not going to be so easy for me to just dismiss. Like, if you say something that doesn't immediately seem right to me, for me to just be like, oh, that's just some, I don't know, delusional nut job. It's like, this is a guy that I know and like and respect, so, like, maybe I should consider why he thinks differently about something than I do, rather than just, or, in many cases, like, the people that I'm dismissing, like, I think deserve to be dismissed. I don't mean to say it's just, like, convenient on my part. I think, if I'm, like, there's a reason I'm not bringing, like, Ann Coulter on the show to talk about this,
Right. Yeah, I don't think that you and Ann Coulter are going to see eye to eye at any point during a 1-hour podcast. So probably not. Yeah.
So let's start this off, and I kind of just want to ask you, like, as specifically as possible, like, what are your concerns? Because you've raised some things on Twitter, and I know Twitter doesn't really give you the space to articulate these things, but, like, from the perspective of a working comedian, what is it that you're worried about, either for yourself or for other comics?
Yeah, so that's such a big question, but I guess I can try to tackle
food on the table.
yeah, I could just put, like, one little piece of this buffet in my mouth at a time. Yeah. But I have a lot of concerns, and mostly they come from the spirit of creativity. So my training is in theater, music, and then I eventually found acting was less, I guess, rewarding for me, like, spiritually, than comedy. And I eventually came to the conclusion that the reason I was studying all of these other performing arts was because my favorite sound in the world was hearing people laugh. So just to give some, a little bit of framework of where I'm coming from. So a lot of my training and a lot of the exploration I've done in terms of developing my own creativity involves a freedom that is necessary for true creativity to occur. So the creative space needs to be a judgment-free zone, a safe, I hate to use this term because it's so loaded, but a safe space where if you try something in a creative environment and it absolutely fails, or it doesn't have the desired effect, or it's just, not good, and that's a loaded word too, but to say that art is good or bad is obviously a question of aesthetics. But the person creating the art is typically best served to not concern himself or herself with what the audience will think, at least in the beginning of the creative process. Okay? So I know this is kind of ephemeral or something, but look, what I'm getting at is there's brilliance out there in the comedy world that I'm witness to on a nightly basis when there's no global pandemic in progress. And a lot of that brilliance is now kind of under attack by people like the star of the article that I shared. I wanted to get the ball rolling with talking about the state of comedy on Twitter with comedy fans. What I didn't expect was that the poker players would jump in, and really it ended up being mostly poker players engaging in this conversation. I was surprised that no comedians really got involved too much in the conversation, and I was even more surprised that comedy fans didn't seem to want to share their opinions either, because my followers are into one of three categories. Okay, people who follow me on Twitter are either comedians that I know, comedy fans that like my stuff, or poker players or poker personnel in some way. So did I answer at all?
I was just going to say on that last point, I think I belong in both of those last two categories. I mean, I've probably only consumed, less than 1% of the comedy that you have, but I think relative to the average non-comic, I'm probably in the top, like, 5% of U.S. citizens in terms of, going to comedy shows and watching comedy specials and that sort of thing. So I think you can count me as a notch in both of those last two categories, as a comedy fan and a poker player.
Agreed. And, you've come to some of my comedy shows before, and you've talked to me about different comedians and the ones that you like and respect. I know you follow other comedians besides me on Twitter, which is frankly rude. But yeah, I definitely would put you in that category, which is why I was so happy to engage in this sort of philosophical argument. I don't even want to say argument, but we definitely discussed what's going on in comedy, and kind of the thrust of the article I shared was that there's this guy named Seth Simon who is basically a pretty powerful writer, comedy critic, if you will, and he seems to have an agenda that comedians who don't share his political views should be silenced, and he seems to be taking measures to silence them. For example, getting this one fired from his writing job, or that one banned from this comedy club, or trying to get people to not go to a certain comedy club because the owner uses certain comedians. So I think that was really what the article was about, like almost like this guy sees himself as the comedy police. And, as a creative person myself, I don't like the idea of creativity being policed. So that was kind of my gut reaction and what started the conversation.
Yeah, and I will say, I'm not familiar with this particular individual, so I'm not going to be real well equipped to engage in the specifics of that. I would draw a pretty sharp distinction between criticism of things that people say on stage versus silencing and some of the things that you mentioned I think are silencing, like trying to get people fired from jobs or prevent them from getting hired from jobs in the first place. And I mean, this is a distinction that shows up even in Supreme Court jurisprudence on the idea of prior restraint. Is it you might face consequences for something you say after the fact, but you can still say it, and usually there's a higher bar for stopping someone from saying a thing in the first place. And I think there's probably room to talk about both of those categories of things. I'm not even necessarily anti any form of what we might call silencing, but I think it's certainly a lot harder to make a case for the legitimizing the silencing. I don't really, and I think we may even have a difference of opinion on the on just the criticism side of things, of just that the creative space should be a judgment-free zone. I guess I understand. So it feels to me when you're putting something out there, you're asserting something and you're making an argument. And I think it's not that other forms of art don't get criticized, but if I paint a painting, I'm not necessarily or as explicitly making as an argument as I think a lot of comics are. Even if they're doing it in the form of a joke, there's still a point to it, and there's something that they're trying to convey. There's an idea that they're trying to express. And I do think it's valuable to have people, I think it's good to have a space where people can experiment with ideas, including ideas that are unpopular or uncomfortable or whatever. But I guess it's not obvious to me. I guess it seems to me the part of that space is that they can get, that they may get criticized for those ideas. That seems like part of the process to me.
100%. And so let me make the distinction between the creative space that I'm mentioning and, say, for example, somebody's Netflix special. The creative space I was referring to earlier is kind of that earlier process where a lot of what people like this Simon guy, well, we don't even have to talk about him because as you mentioned, you're not as familiar with him, but what I find is happening a lot in comedy, and the thing that kind of irks me the most, or even more than irks me, it scares me the most, is that what happens in a comedy club is not going to translate well to somebody blogging about it the next day, because what happens in the comedy club is the creative space is kind of heightened, and the audience has its own personality. So when you have a packed house and they kind of tell you earlier in the night where they set the bar. Say for example, a comedian makes an off-color joke that might be offensive to some audiences but won't be offensive to other audiences, and then the audience laughs hysterically at that questionable joke. That comedian will often come backstage and tell the other comedians, "Oh, this crowd is live. They're up for anything." And that kind of tells those of us that have some material that might be only used for, discretion is advised, which audiences you break this particular joke out on. We'll say, okay, so we can greenlight all of our jokes tonight, right? But then if there's a blogger or someone that's in the audience that wants to say, especially when it comes to famous comedians, that they, for whatever reason, they were offended by this joke, or I can't believe this comedian said this, that, or the other, and now the Twitter sphere starts to gang up on that comedian and say, you never should have said something like that, this is hateful, this is phobic. Never mind that the audience had a great time and no one in the room was actually analyzing the material in that way because of the group mentality that audiences develop. Each audience sets its own bar. Now, to be clear, Andrew, as you know from watching my stuff, I'm not exactly the edgiest comic in the world, so it's actually a little bit odd that I'm the one that's always kind of banging the drum and championing this particular cause, because it's not like I'm Anthony Jeselnik, or it's just not my.
Well, no, that's part of why I take it more seriously, because I know that it's not. You don't have as much of a personal investment. Like, I'm sure you have friends who are maybe in that category, but it's not like you're defending yourself here. Like, you clearly have a principle that you believe in.
Yeah, it's more about a principle, because like the type of material that I like to write and perform is actually usually not very questionable as far as its offensiveness. Although if you try hard enough, you can find someone somewhere who's offended by all of my jokes. It's just because each individual has his or her own barometer, or where the line is, right? So a lot of times what you'll see on Twitter is someone saying, I went to the Comedy Cellar last night and this comedian crossed the line, But what that person is not really acknowledging is that her line might be different from yours or mine. And in fact, it almost definitely is different, because that's a personal thing where your line is. Do you find this offensive? Now, there are some things, if we want to take an extreme example, if my joke is some kind of hateful joke about, how all black people should go back to Africa or something, I think that everyone would agree that's crossed everybody's line, right? That's not what I'm talking about, though. I'm talking about something that is a little bit more in the gray area, where it could be offensive, it could also be funny, it could be offensive and funny. And this is where people have to realize that art is going to, a lot of times art will have this effect. Like, if you take Igor Stravinsky, now that it's springtime, his most famous piece of music was The Rite of Spring, right? So I don't know if you ever heard The Rite of Spring, but back in 1908 or whatever it was, I might have the year wrong, people actually left the concert hall when the symphony orchestra played Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, because it's an orchestral piece about how people tend to be more awakened in springtime for their mating season rituals and things like that. And people were actually offended, and they actually left. And so the customers had the right to leave and show their displeasure with the piece, because for them, and remind you, it's instrumental orchestral music that they thought crossed the line. And so I guess that's what I'm getting at, is your line. And some people stayed and listened to The Rite of Spring. Some people certainly enjoyed it. And some people were so offended by it, they didn't stay for the rest of the performance. So now 100 and, whatever years later, it's widely regarded as one of the masterpieces in classical music history. So how do we know? It's when you get into a question of aesthetics, right? This is good, this is bad. It's like somebody might say, oh, country music is garbage. And somebody else might say, I really like the sound of country music. And I think that we don't really do that as much with comedy. I think that some people approach comedy with the idea that the first litmus test is this in any way offensive to any individual or group? Or could it be construed as being that? And if so, I don't want to laugh because I want to feel like I'm on the right side of morality. And there never used to be this synergy between morality and laughter and what's comedy. And so in a way, comedians are being more careful, and that in itself is stifling creativity in the name of trying not to hurt people. And I have mixed feelings about whether that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think stifling creativity is, there's always, like, that's a cost. And I would draw a distinction between just offending people versus, like, I think there are other kinds of harm that can be caused besides just like a person who was in the audience at that moment getting offended. In fact, I think like often the worst harm can be caused when no one in the audience is offended, when in fact like everyone is fully on board. So even in the example that you used, I mean, you said like that would cross everyone's line in the case of like, a really racist joke. And I mean, I think it's true that like you would be unlikely to find an audience unless it was a very self-selected group in the United States where like very many people would feel comfortable laughing at that. But I mean, it doesn't seem inconceivable to me that like the KKK or some other like hate group, like, I mean, they have conventions, they have, like, I think they could find a comedian who would, someone who would do something that, resembles comedy in the sense of, standing up, telling things to get a laugh, where like they are sharing jokes along those lines, where like there is an entire audience of people who are sort of like clapping and applauding and cheering for that. And I think even in a case where it's like there's not as much of a consensus on it, but so like an example that I would point to would be any sort of like transphobic humor. And I know that's one that's kind of like set off a lot of these controversies of late, where like I think it's not probably too hard to find an audience where like a fair number of people will laugh at a joke that some other people would consider transphobic or something like that. And the harm wouldn't necessarily be just, I mean, like there would be harm done if there were, a trans person in the audience or like someone else who were offended by that. But I think the bigger problem would be if transphobia is something that contributes to real life harm against trans people. And I believe that it is. Like, a lot of trans people are attacked or even killed just for sort of being who they are or looking the way that they do or whatever. And I think to the extent that someone kind of like telling jokes that reinforce negative views of trans people, I think is like contributing to that mentality. I don't mean to say that like that's the only reason it's happening, but I think that like there is a force called, we call it transphobia. I think phobia is a kind of misleading term in that context, but like there is a sort of like anti-trans zeitgeist in some part of the population, and like that does translate into violence against people. And I think that it's like making jokes that or sort of like a comedy that reinforces those kinds of beliefs, I think can have harm above and beyond like offending particular members of the audience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it more than makes sense. I mean, it's a very good point, especially, and I think that one reason why it's wise to look at trans issues as a way to kind of dissect this point that you're making is, as opposed to black issues, I mean, nearly the entire population agrees with people being born black and, they're black and they deserve rights. I mean, that is the KKK, like you mentioned, and people that sympathize with them is actually a very, very, very small percentage of the population. But
it's not as small as I thought it was a few years ago, but yeah.
Well, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But it's still a lot smaller than the group that is uncomfortable, let's say, uncomfortable with trans people unfamiliar with trans people, undecided about how they feel about trans people. There is a lot of, the idea of someone that was born with these genitalia and now has those genitalia will certainly spark certain kinds of feelings among just about everybody. And so would you want to do that yourself? Why would that person want to do that? These are kind of questions as the world comes to terms with the fact that trans people are here and they're not going anywhere, and whether we should let them use this bathroom or that bathroom or whatever is kind of at the front of a lot of people's thinking nowadays, especially people that are in politics and or like to discuss that sort of thing online. But honestly, the average American person probably has never even met a trans person. And of course, here in New York, I probably have like at least 35 I can name that live in my building, but I'm in a really liberal city where trans people are much more accepted. So suppose I'm on stage, and I wouldn't make jokes about trans people, but suppose I'm, as a comedian, I'm on stage and I make a joke, and someone in the audience doesn't know anything about trans people and is basically, because he's unfamiliar and he's from a place where he doesn't think he knows any trans people, he might be swayed to think a certain way about them based on whether or not something I said was funny to him, or if it reinforces his general fear of them, or whatever stereotype he thinks they fit into. I definitely see that as a problem, and that comedians are contributing to the detriment of society in that way. But let me give you an example. I know several trans comedians. In fact, on my other podcast, most of your listeners probably know about the Tournament Poker Edge podcast, but I also co-host the Broadway Comedy Club radio podcast, and we recently recorded an interview with Julia Scotti, who was a semi-finalist on America's Got Talent and also is trans. And so we spoke with her, and we also, I have a friend that performs in my show here in New York named Allison Grillo, and she is trans, and she actually has a joke where she tells the audience, I used to be a waitress, and before that, I was a waiter. So that's a trans person kind of poking lighthearted fun at being trans, right? So does that mean that all jokes about trans people are offensive? So that's where we have to try to figure out on a case-by-case basis which jokes are doing harm and which jokes are just having fun.
Yeah, I don't even necessarily have a problem with offensive. I think it's more just like that. I guess I felt like what you were saying earlier was that if you weren't there that night, or if you weren't part of the audience, then you can't really like have an opinion on what was said, or like respond to what was said in the context of like bloggers or something like that. And I think that like there is a national like I think the distinction between like, so we certainly don't have like a full-on consensus, or like I don't think either of us think we're where we should be in terms of race relations or civil rights for non-white people or things along those lines. But like I think the sort of like terms of the national conversation on race are different than what they are on trans people, and I think there is more sort of like current controversy around trans things, and I think that or trans issues, and I think that they're like part of this national dialogue. I think like comedians should be part of that dialogue. I don't even necessarily have a problem with people. Like I think part of the value of the creative space is that like there are arguments being had, and some of this is as broad as like should they be allowed to use the bathroom, yes or no? But I think like I'm not even really like aware of the contours of all these arguments, but I'm sure like within trans community, like I'm sure your friends who are trans comedians are like have much more nuanced idea of like what are some of the debates like even within their communities that are probably getting hashed out in some of their shows. So I think it's not really a matter of like, well, they shouldn't be allowed to say it because it's offensive, as much as like what they're saying is part of a national dialogue or a national conversation, national debate, whatever you want to call it, that we're all having. And like there are going to be people who have responses to the things that they're saying. And if people are saying things that other people find like not just offensive in the sense of like, whoo, I can't, like pearl clutching, but like I think it's like, it's a problem, or I think it's like dangerous for people to believe this thing that you're encouraging people to believe, and so I want to like push back against that. Like that seems to me perfectly legitimate, and the only question is like exactly what forms should that pushback be allowed to take. But I guess I don't really buy the like, well, if no one in the audience was offended, then like no one else gets to have an opinion on it. If that, I'm not sure if that's like really a fair summary of your opinion. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to clarify what I meant by that. Sometimes the blogs or the tweets or whatever, morning after a comedy show, things that I see that bother me, they seem to take the viewpoint that the audience was offended by the comedian. And many times, because I was also in the room myself, I know that's not true. So my only point there is that I think that when you take something that was clearly a joke, now in order for a comedian to get a laugh in New York City, where the audiences are about as liberal as you'll find, the audience has to suspend disbelief as far as every single word this comedian is saying is his or her honest opinion, and also kind of get on board with the fact that it's midnight on a Saturday night, and this is the place where we say the things that we don't say at 2:00 in the afternoon at the office on a Tuesday or something like that. So it's just, in a sense, when you share what a comedian said, as you do clutch your pearls, you are, in a sense, inherently taking that thing out of context, because something in the context of the comedy show and the comedy club is not the same as it is on Twitter, is not the same as it is like in the workplace, right? So it's kind of like after midnight, half the audience, at least, from every audience I talk to, I would say about half of them, maybe a little more, they show up at the door that night expecting to hear the unspeakable spoken. And so I just, my point about the bloggers or whatever is not that they don't have any good points to make about kind of looking at comedy as one of the forms of communication that we have in the world, but more so that when they start getting after this joke or that joke, they're really taking everything out of context, because the audience kind of sets the bar, what can be said and what can't. And if the audience isn't on board, the comedian will immediately have to either lean into it and try to make that funny, which usually doesn't work, or just change tacks. So that's my point, is that you're always taking it out of context when you tell me the next day what somebody said at a comedy show.
Yeah, I feel like you're still relying on the, this particular audience's boundary. So I do think the context is important. I think it's like, we're fully on the same page that like if you're a critic or someone who's misrepresenting intentionally or not what was said, then you're failing, and like I'm not intending to defend those people. I guess I just want to defend the idea that like it is I think critics have a role, or people who are like talking back have a role, and I think like criticism of comedians, including from people who like weren't at the show or like didn't see the entire thing. I guess I'm not really on board with the like you can't possibly appreciate the context of it, or like I guess it kind of sounds like what you're saying is it's fine as long as the current audience was fine with it. And that just doesn't, like, that seems to me that, you know, you have people sort of like stoking prejudices to get, you know, like there's a lot of like easy humor that comes from just kind of like encouraging people to I mean, I guess even the whole idea of like saying the things that can't be said or whatever, like the kind of underlying idea of that is, well, we all like secretly believe these things, just like polite society means we can't say them out loud, which is kind of like the whole, you know, grab them by the pussy Trump thing was kind of like, oh, he's just saying what we're all thinking. And I'm like, oh, no, we're not all thinking that. Like, I don't.
Yeah, and also it's like kind of like the idea that everything that's said in the locker room is some kind of safe space for men to be, you know, misogynist or something because it's locker room talk. Yeah, I'm certainly not talking about that. What I mean specifically is that they will often present the audience as having been offended. Like, none of us could believe what this horrible thing that this comedian said last night. Can you believe this hate speech that happened at Stand Up New York last night or whatever? And like, if I was there and I know that the audience was not offended, or, you know, they were laughing and the comedian was clearly making a joke. So I guess what we're really getting at, though, is the idea that something could be just a joke. So let me give you a couple other examples. I have a friend, I don't want to say his name, but he's a pretty well-known comedian, and he has material about how when he was a young man, he used to work in a deli, and when the black customers would come in, before they ordered all the extras on their sandwich, they would always ask, is that free? You know, he would say, do you want cheese? And they're like, is it free? And he'd say, yes. They say, put that on there, right? And he's a white comedian talking about his personal experience, and what he noticed was the difference between the black customers and the white customers. Definitely walking that line between being offensive and racism or just making a joke. Now, here's what I noticed. I've seen this guy do this joke about 20 times, so I think that's a pretty good sample to see the patterns. When the audience is at least 10% black, the whole audience laughs at the joke. When the audience is more than 50% black, it's like his best joke. And when there are very few or no black people in the audience, the joke bombs every time. So what that means is, now you got to remember, I'm speaking as a comedian, the point of view of our job is to do whatever it takes to make those people laugh, right? The audience has its own morality about, can we laugh about this? And that will change based on the demographics and the vibe of the audience, because no New York City resident wants to feel like he's laughing at a Klan meeting, right? That's not the vibe here. We don't want that. But if it's almost like you have to kind of feel like, okay, so we've all agreed that tonight we can laugh about this because it's relatively harmless. It may promote other stereotypes that are not as harmless, but in the context of dipping your toe in that water and taking a little bit of a risk, sometimes this joke like brings the house down. But if I just told you the words to the joke on Twitter, I think everyone would say this is an offensive joke. This is racially charged, offensive material. And that's what I mean when I say you kind of have to be there. And so it's not as cut and dried as like, well, we can look at the words and, you know, define each word and then figure out whether this should be allowed or not allowed, especially when the joke actually works better in a black audience. Now, there could be other reasons for that. Maybe they want to seem cool, but they're actually offended. You know, I don't know. But it seems like the laughs are pretty genuine. And by the way, again, that's not my joke. I'm talking about someone else's joke because I don't really have any jokes in that vein. But there, you know, there's a lot of backlash against Michael Che, who, by the way, is not my favorite comedian. One time he and I got into an argument when he was on Twitter, which he's not anymore, about something that he wrote that I said, you know, I'm kind of offended by this. And he's like, and you're supposed to be a comedian? When are you performing next? I want to come see you. Like, he was almost bullying me, like like that I would be so intimidated to have him in the audience or whatever. So it's not like I'm defending him as his friend, because I don't consider him a friend, and I don't think he considers me a friend. But again, like, just standing on my principles, he made a joke once about when Donald Trump said that trans people in the military, he didn't want to have trans people in the military, and so they were passing a law or something about that. And Michael Che on national television, Saturday Night Live, said that this new policy is called "Don't Ask, Don't Tuck." Okay, like, some people laughed, some people were upset. That's a perfect example of a joke that different people will take different ways. And I think a lot of it depends on what kind of sense of humor you have, right? I don't think laughing at that joke makes you transphobic. I don't think writing that joke makes you transphobic. If you are transphobic, I think that joke will be funnier to you, right? But there's kind of like, there's your moral code and then there's your funny bone. And I think that sometimes woke society, if you will, doesn't make the distinction. Like, if something is on the wrong moral side because of the harm it could potentially do, or the reinforcing of things that should not be reinforced, that they're unable to or unwilling to take it for what it is, which is, it's a joke.
Yeah, I get, even like my own reaction to that joke is like, not like, I guess, having a problem with the kind of like underlying to the extent that there is an idea underlying it, having a problem with that, and also just as a sort of like a craft. Like, I think it's a or sort of just like a clever turn of phrase or whatever. So, I mean, like, to the extent that I think you can just sort of be like, well, that's funny regardless of whether I agree with the like underlying thing of it. Like, I guess that is kind of my reaction to that specific joke. And I think that like having, like, I think it's like, I think there should at least be a dialogue around that. Like, I think that if he's going to make a joke like that on national television, I mean, like, I'm surely like he and the writers are aware that there's going to be that sort of that people are going to have a reaction to that, and I mean, that's probably part of why they're putting it on there. And I think that, like, I'm not necessarily saying that kind of joke shouldn't appear there at all, but I think it's like, there are definitely, and I know that there are people who would say that it shouldn't, and I don't even necessarily know that those people are wrong. I don't have really a firm opinion on that particular one, as much as, like, I think at the very least, if it's going to be delivered on national television, like, it's a healthy thing that there are people saying, like, that was a problem, or like, here's why that's a problem, or here's why, even though that doesn't seem like a problem to you, it actually is. Like, I think there are a lot of things where people, and I'm aware that we're two cis white guys having this conversation, where, like, we're really not the people who are likely to be on the harmed side of a lot of this. So I like, a lot of my, it's not that I'm like personally harmed by a lot of this, as much as kind of like trying to follow what I see as like arguments made by people who are more kind of like at risk from some of these ideas being perpetuated. And so I think, like, there is something to be said for, it doesn't, like, it seems to you, I don't mean you, Clayton, just like, whoever is laughing at a certain joke, like, it seems to you like this is just sort of like a harmless joke and a safe thing to laugh at, because you're not the person who has to deal with the consequences of it. So I think, like, I think that there exists a world of things that seems completely unproblematic to some people, and like a perfectly fine thing to just sort of like make jokes about and laugh about, like, oh, we can all just sort of laugh about this thing. And then I think it's like valuable to then have other people, and part of the value of this space is that they articulate those things, and other people can say to them, like, oh, that's not actually as fine as you think it is. Like, I think that's a better outcome than if they just never say those things out loud at all. But I do think that, like, getting the feedback on that of, you thought that was funny, but actually, it's at least like also harmful. That seems like a valuable thing to me, for that feedback to exist.
Yeah, in theory, I agree with that. I say in theory because I think that often the person who is saying, well, actually, is basically saying they're kind of being like a party pooper. You know what I mean? It's like we're all having fun. Everyone's laughing at this joke. No one's actually being offended by it.
Well,
it's
no,
clearly
but that's
a
the
joke.
part I don't agree. Like
right.
No one's being offended by a part I don't think is right. Like I mean, they are pooping on someone's party deliberately. Like the point is, like, there are people having a party at someone else's expense, and hopefully those people don't realize it's at someone else's expense, that they're not doing it deliberately with the intention of harming people. But the people who are being harmed by it are saying, like, I'm going to go ahead and ruin this party for you because it's actually at my expense, even though you don't realize that. That's what I mean to say.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that I don't want to keep repeating myself, but what I see is that often in the audience, the people who would theoretically be offended by such a joke are having the time of their lives, and then the cisgendered white people that are trying to police the culture are telling everyone why they should be offended, even though the people who would be the quote-unquote target of such a joke are actually enjoying the joke. So I think that we get into a problem where we try to like protect everybody else. Now, I'm not saying that we as cisgendered white males can't have opinions about these things, but I do notice that, like as in the case of the deli joke that I mentioned earlier, I feel like and that's why you'll see like on Comedy Central or whatever, when they show a special, if a comedian makes a joke about another race, they almost always show a member of that race laughing at the joke in the audience to kind of tell the viewer at home, like, see, it's okay, we're all laughing. And on one hand, I think that that's kind of cheap, like saying, hey, look, it's not hate speech because this white person's laughing at the white thing. I think that's kind of stupid. But it happens in real life that the people that are supposed to be offended are not, and then other people are trying to like stand up for them, even though the people that are supposedly offended are not. Now, I mean, it's very hard to say like no one's offended. Like I shouldn't have said that earlier. I don't mean that no one's offended, but as a comic, I never want the audience to leave feeling like I was so offended by that comedy show. I will never go to that guy's show ever again. So like, I mean, I have a financial and personal interest in making sure that my comedy is not offensive. And that interest is at odds with my views on creativity in general. I know that the best work happens when you're not judging what you're doing while you're creating it. Now, I'm not talking about when you put it out there like for millions to see, but I'm talking about while you're creating it. And that's another problem I have with comedy club bloggers, is we can't write without the audience. So I need to try and fail in front of an audience without worrying about somebody saying, this comedian did this terrible thing last night at this comedy club. And there's a lot of this kind of comedy policing going on, when really what needs to happen is comedian tries a joke, audience laughs or doesn't laugh, and the comedian learns how to do it better or whatever. I don't think that we need comedy police, because the comedy club is not the political platform. The comedy club is an entertainment venue where if the people in it are not entertained, the owner will find out very quickly, and then those comedians will lose their jobs. We don't need bloggers also attacking our jobs because they don't like whether what we said was woke enough or not.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it should be that it should be the people who are potentially harmed, and I want to use the word harmed rather than offended. I think offended makes it sound like it's just I think there are harms aside from just like that sort of hurt my feelings.
But yeah, that's fine. We'll say harmed. Yeah.
So I do think that like the people getting outraged on behalf of other people who are not actually, like, I think that is sort of obnoxious, and like I understand why that they're sort of like bad standard bearers for the position that I want to uphold. I fully agree with that. I actually had an experience that I thought of when you mentioned the deli joke, which I think is well, I'll just tell the story. So I was working at a debate camp on the south side of Chicago with two friends who were both black, one of whom lived in that area. And so one night after working at the camp, we went to her friend's apartment, and so it was like me as the only white person and probably like 7 or 8 black people, and they were watching The Flavor of Love, which I don't know if you remember this show. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, Flavor Flav.
Yes.
Yeah,
so
I know.
For people who don't know, this was a dating show hosted by Flavor Flav, which you can just Google Flavor Flav if you don't know who that is. That'll offer a better description than what I could do here. And so the show is sort of it's sort of a bunch of mostly black women trying to date Flavor Flav, and essentially this turned into a very kind of like awkward situation. This is obviously a show that like this black audience like they were watching it before I got there. Like that was like what they were doing when we showed up. So then I was just sort of like watching it with them, and at some point one of the ones who was my friend who I had gone there with, said, I mean, she was like kind of joking when she said this, but like clearly she thought it was like important to say. She was like, we're not all like this or something. She was sort of like, as although they were enjoying this kind of like, I think they were worried about how I was going to perceive it. And I think I kind of remember Dave Chappelle, like I think this was part of his argument for why he stopped doing his show. Like despite the fact that his show was popular with black people, I think he felt like a lot of white people were laughing at it for the wrong reasons. So it's not just a matter of like I can understand how black people might laugh at that deli joke in a way where I can see how they would both find it. They could both find it personally funny, but also worry about how about like that they might find it funny for a different reason than some white audiences might. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. Like, are you laughing at us or are you laughing with us? Is kind of the ultimate.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's really what it boils down to. Is do you think that we can all like there was you want to go back and really like revise what's okay for comedians to do? Go and look at early Chappelle's show. I mean, he's making fun of crackheads. He did a whole thing like if black people get reparations, they're all going to use the money to buy rims for their cars. Like, that if a white comedian made the exact same joke, oh boy, it would have been like instant cancel, right?
And I'm good with that seems approximately right to me. Like, I think he's capable of making those jokes. Like, I think that he has a different sort of experience and maybe he does. I mean, I think he probably caught some flack from the black community even then, and maybe would catch more now. But like, I think like, I guess that doesn't strike. Maybe you're not saying it's a problem, but like that doesn't strike me as a problem that like he can say that and you can't.
No, not at all. I mean, it kind of goes to the same question of whether someone who's not part of the group is offended by something that is allegedly offending a group that's actually not offended, and I think it kind of works the same way. Like when it's someone within the minority group poking fun at something that exists within his or her own minority group, like I don't think that that's going to be ever offensive to anybody. So in other words, like if Gabriel Iglesias wants to talk about Latinos, he can virtually say anything about Latinos because he's Latino himself, and he's kind of talking to his audience, which is mostly Latino people. And if I, as an observer from the outside, find it funny or not, I really don't have the right to be offended because it's kind of like for us, by us sort of thing, right? And so, yeah, Chappelle's issue, one of the issues why he fled to Africa famously, like in the middle of the most popular show on television, was that he was having like a moral dilemma about what kind of laughs he was getting from non-black audiences. And I think that is, something that's kind of hard to come to terms with. Like, am I part of the problem in a sense, right? Now, Chappelle has always been kind of controversial. He's one of my favorite comedians, by the way. So, but that's again an aesthetic viewpoint. I try not to talk about what's good or bad or what I like or don't like, but it is interesting that how much I've always gravitated towards him because I think that he's so funny, first of all, but also he's really good at getting you to see things a certain way. Like one of my favorite jokes he ever did was when he was talking about the election and everything, and he said, that's why I want every single black man and woman to get out and register for a firearm. And everyone thought he was about to say register to vote, but he said, you want to see good gun laws in this country? Let's get more black people with guns. And then it's like, it makes you laugh, but it also makes you think, like, he's probably right. That would result in a much more stringent control of, assault rifles and everything else. So, what he's great at, and what I don't try to do with my comedy generally, but what he's great at is making you look at society or politics or life on Earth and seeing it in a different way that both makes you laugh but also makes you think. And he comes under fire for certain things he says. They really went after him for the joke that he has about when gays started getting the right to marry, and they had the lesbians and the gays kind of in one category, right? And so it was like the homosexual community, and then the bisexuals were like, can we join this party because we want rights too? And then they were all like in the same car, and things were going really well, and people started to become more accepting of homosexuals, bisexuals, and that was cool. And then the trans community wanted to get their rights at the same time and kind of join the party. And so that's what that joke is about. Like, maybe not everyone in the gay community was like, oh, do we really want to try to fight this battle at the same time as we're trying to fight our own battle? Because it really is a different question. Do you accept gay people? Do you accept trans people? It's not the same question. And Chappelle was making fun of the fact that the trans people were, in a sense, trying to ride on the coattails of the recent political developments that were going on in the gay community. And, if you don't believe in nuance and you don't look at the subtleties of that joke, wherein Chappelle's not even saying whether or not he thinks it's good or bad or neutral that some gay people felt this way. He's just saying that this is kind of what happened. It caused a huge backlash, and without nuance, it just looks like he's being transphobic. Now, he was never saying they don't deserve rights. He was saying not everyone was on board with them crashing the party or joining the movement or trying to put more letters on the LGB, right, the whole thing. And the thing is, as a societal commentator, as some comedians are, again, not me, but the Chappelles of this world are, I think the barometer needs to be, or the litmus test, if you will, should be, is it funny? Number one. Is it coming from a place of hate? What is he trying to do with that joke? And that's where we get lost, because it's almost like if you just use the word trans, you are going to be accused by someone of being homophobic against trans people. Not every joke punches down. But it's easier, it's just like in politics. There's always a false binary, You're either in favor of open borders or you're a racist bigot, right? That's a false binary. You can be not in favor of open borders, but also care a lot about immigrants in America. That's a much harder conversation to have than just say, you're either with me or you're against me. And I think that this happens a lot in comedy too.
Yeah, I don't think the stark binaries or the lack of nuance are helping anybody. I do think that it's like I think you can, without coming from a place of hate, like inadvertently do things that harm people. And I guess it's not fair to accuse you of being hateful for that, but I think saying like this thing that you did, this is another sort of like buzzword for people, but just say like this was problematic, or like here's why you shouldn't keep doing that joke even though it's getting laughs. Like that seems to me, in the same way that you'll say, the comedy club is a place where people sort of like experiment with jokes and get feedback from the audience in terms of whether they're funny. It seems to me proper that they're also getting feedback from the blogosphere or whatever. And again, like, many of these people may be obnoxious, many of them may be wrong. I'm not going to defend, like, I'm sure there's plenty of like bad bloggers who do this badly. But just as there are many bad comedians who do comedy badly, and that's fine.
For sure.
But just that, like, I think that is also part of the process, or part of this national conversation that takes place, that the comedy is a part of, that like part of what they're getting feedback on is not just whether the joke is funny, but also is like, to the extent that they are expressing an underlying idea, whether they're fully aware of that or not. Like, part of the problem is a lot of times we're not aware of what all of our biases are. So like, we think we're just saying something that's like totally this is just like, everyone can sort of be fine with this, or like, this isn't a controversial thing to say, and then like it turns out like that is controversial for some reason that you didn't realize, and you may or may not end up agreeing with that controversy. But like, if it like being aware that argument exists, and like, I guess I think like people have a right to like push back against, even if you weren't coming from a place of hate. If people think like the thing that you said does have a harmful effect, or potentially have a harmful effect, like, then they want to push back on that.
Yeah, and I'm on board with criticism. I actually enjoy sometimes speaking with audience members, especially strong thinkers like yourself, about this joke I did, or that joke I did, or why I said this when the waitress dropped the drinks, or whatever else can happen throughout the course of a comedy show. It's always nice to kind of do a post-game analysis afterwards, almost like we do in poker. Like, should I have check raised on that flop? It's very similar. Comedians will get together just like poker players do and talk about, did you watch my set tonight? What did you think about this new idea I had? How did you like how I handled that heckler? Whatever else, in a very similar way. And there might be why there's a lot more overlap between poker players and comedy fans than I originally thought there were. But yeah, I want to take you back. You and I are both old enough, Andrew, to remember the late 80s, early 90s, I guess it was, when censorship was strictly the purview of the conservative Christian right. And music, you mentioned Flavor Flav, artists like Public Enemy, Two Live Crew, even AC/DC, and others were being censored by people that were on the right.
Although Tipper Gore was part of that. Not that she's like a hardcore, or Gore is a hardcore leftist or anything, but wasn't Tipper Gore kind of like leading that charge too?
Yeah, Tipper Gore was kind of became synonymous with it, but she was. It's really hard to judge which politicians are actually right or left, because it seems like everybody's just, where's the money? But yeah, she had a lot of donors that were, kind of Christian organizations, churches. Politics was pretty different back then. But yeah, I mean, I guess, of course, Al Gore is a well-known left-leaning liberal type guy.
Yeah, I agree that the criticism is still coming from a conservative place, regardless of whether that particular politician identified as conservative. Yeah,
she ended up being kind of the face of it. And, that's why we have warning labels on music now. Not that CDs are still a thing, but when you would buy CDs, you would see that warning label. I don't even know how people get their music now, but I think it's still a law that explicit content, like, for example, if you and I use certain language on this podcast, Apple will give you an explicit tag.
We just have that constantly tagged on there, so we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, well, that's cool.
I think partly because gambling is considered in some circles, controversial content, or the sort of thing that the youth of America need to be sheltered from.
Yeah, you have to be at least 18 to hear about poker. yeah. But
just like you and I were, no poker until we turned 18.
Right, absolutely, right until your 18th birthday. Yeah, when your dad shared a beer with you when you turned 21, that's when you learned about betting, right? But we remember a time when this was kind of the rallying cry. This rap music and these heavy metal lyrics are killing our children. It's satanic, and they wanted to kind of put an end to it. And liberal viewpoints were always, look, freedom of speech, we can do what we want, our music can say whatever we want. And it's very curious to me how now censorship seems to be something that the left has a lot more interest in than the right. Now, I know we don't really I'm not trying to make this a political discussion, but I do find that very curious. And as someone who started in comedy in the year 2000, okay, so now here I am 21 years doing this, I've seen the shift during my career that comedy was different. Like the spirit of, you could say whatever you want. The audience is fully expecting you to say whatever you want. Nothing is off limits. Of course, everything, like there were secret limits. Like if a comedian truly pushed the limits, that comedian would find out very quickly. But now the culture is such that people are more concerned with whether something is problematic than whether it's funny. And I think that sometimes that is hurting comedy in general, because there's a small group of people that want to stop everybody else from making certain jokes because they're worried about whether something is hurtful or problematic. And I'm not saying that small group is wrong, but that small group is very vocal. And I think what happens, and maybe what we haven't really touched on yet, is that the pendulum shifts the other way. Like, just like with music, the more you tell me I shouldn't do this or I shouldn't do that, like you see it with Michael Che, the more I want to go even further, because now that I know that you're a snowflake or whatever, like all the kind of like words that we use for people that have any type of morality, well, I'm sorry, I hurt your feelings, snowflake, right? They want to go even further, and that kind of creates a beast. And this exact thing happened in music. All of that gangster rap came from this. They're like, well, you can't say certain things in music. So the next thing you know, the hit song is F the Police, Cop Killer, right? Because they didn't want to be policed. And there was also a lot of problems with the Los Angeles Police Department. And now that you're telling me I have to like be careful what I say in my songs, no, screw that. I'm going to write a song about killing police, right? So you see this pendulum swinging the other way, and I fear that everyone who is kind of fighting that good fight to like make comedians be a little bit more careful that what you say doesn't hurt anyone, I think a lot of comedians are going even further to try to push the envelope, and part of it is being fueled by this movement towards censoring comedians.
Yeah, I mean, not that I think we're going to get to the bottom of this today, but I think that the really tricky question is like, how do you get I think we agree that there's a lot of value in letting people explore taboo subjects, and those subjects can be taboo for a lot of different reasons. They offend conservative morality, or they offend liberal morality, or even I think like when they offend everyone's morality. Like I think that there is I think there's value in letting people explore like whatever are like the absolute darkest, like the things that sort of everyone agrees is bad. Like we're probably not 100% right even about those things, or like so like I think that a lot of great artists over time have been what we would call problematic, including a lot of like I mean I don't know that I would go to a Louis C.K. show at this point. I think I would not, but I mean, I'm not going to deny that, like, I did find him funny for a long time. Like, I still, like, I looked at a couple of Louis C.K. clips when we were discussing this, and, like, I thought those were fun. And, like, not just funny, but I think it's, I don't know about this. I think that even if we accept, like, this is a